Good afternoon and welcome back to Real Estate Live UK. Real Estate Live is a week of free events designed to keep the property and regeneration sectors talking during this time. We've got a fantastic panel taking place this afternoon, considering what a carbon zero Croydon might look like, and we've got a really great lineup of speakers for you. We're trying to encourage as much audience participation as possible during these sessions, so to get everyone warmed up as you're joining us, we're going to launch a quick poll, which we've been launching at the beginning of all of our sessions, and we'll be taking a view on what will the most important factor in kickstarting development and recovering the strength of UK real estate post COVID-19 be. So that will be coming up on your screens now, and if you could share your views with us, that would be fantastic. So as that's happening, during the session, we're also going to be hoping that you'll continue participating by sending questions and answers in for the panel. You can do that in the Zoom toolbar. There's a Q&A feature, so feel free at any point during the panel to submit your questions and we'll try to come to as many of them as possible. We've got a big audience today, so if we can't come to you, we'll try and follow up with them afterwards as well. If you like one of the other questions that someone else has put to the panel, feel free to give it a thumbs up and we will make sure that that one gets to the top of the list. The panel this afternoon is being brought to you by Develop Croydon, Croydon Constructing Excellence Club, and with AECOM as our sponsors, and we're really delighted to have all of those partners on board with Real Estate Live. Just in lieu of Stephen Parker, who's the chair of Croydon Constructing Excellence, being with us this afternoon, although I believe he is watching, just a quick mention for Croydon Constructing Excellence. The club is a really thriving and fantastic way to get engaged in the construction sector in Croydon. So if you're part of a contractor working in Croydon or the supply chain, then have a look at our website and get involved with the club. And to introduce the other partner that's brought this session to you, I'm going to hand over to Richard Plant, who's the chair of Develop Croydon, who's just going to say a few words about Develop Croydon and the work that it does for the borough. Richard.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Bonnie. Welcome to Croydon. And as Bonnie has said, this session is brought to you by Develop Croydon Construction Excellence Club and sponsored by AECOM. And it's this sort of partnership approach that typifies what Croydon and Develop Croydon is all about at the moment. Develop Croydon it is in itself a partnership made up of 70 or so partners. They come and go as developments are completed and they move on. And more recently, we've seen them returning for their subsequent schemes and rejoining. It exists for developers, investors, consultants, occupiers, anyone who works or is involved in the regeneration in Croydon, to collaborate and collectively promote Croydon as a place to live, work and invest. It's been going for 10 years and it runs numerous events. We normally have the conference, investor tours and so on, and partner meetings where we share information about up and coming schemes. During this time, it's obviously been harder to meet and collaborate, but we nevertheless have changed and moved with the times, and we've even managed to hold our own virtual investor tour, which followed the normal route of the coach, using a mixture of aerial photography, Google, and pictures of the buildings, and brought in updates from all the various developers. You can actually, if you're interested, watch that on the website using YouTube. We continue to engage with our partners and continue to have new activities. And we had a very good webinar with Councillor Paul Scott and various other people involved in the planning system in Croydon to talk about how that was working in the current time, and appears to be working very well. So we were delighted to be involved with this panel. So what will a carbon zero Croydon look like? Clearly this is a good aspiration. We're all seeing the benefits of less pollution in lockdown. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Alison Crompton from AECOM, who's going to be the chair of the panel. Alison.
Hello, thank you very much to Bonnie and to Richard. Thank you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our well over 100 participants this afternoon, joining us on this sunny afternoon. We want to discuss and debate what a zero carbon Croydon will look like and how we collectively can assist in delivering the ambitious but necessary vision that the council has. We've brought together a panel of experts with different perspectives so we can all learn about what they're contributing to and what they're committed to, as well as learning and hearing about their experience and how they can help us to achieve this, to achieve the ambition of Croydon becoming carbon neutral in just 10 years' time. Sounds a bit scary when you put it in that context. They were only 10 years ago. I will ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves to us, and then we'll consider the pertinent questions. I'll briefly introduce myself and name these panellists, and then we will give everybody a chance to say a few things about themselves before we go to our keynote introduction from Councillor Tony Newman. And then we will take some of the questions that we've already put in the brief and provide different perspectives on them, ideally based on our real world experience. And as Bonnie has said, please put your questions to us, and we will do our best to address them. But with over 200 people potentially on the call today, some of them might not get addressed today, but you can vote up, if that's English, vote up the questions to try and prioritise them for our panel's review today. We are due to finish by 5:30, by which time we'll all be enlightened and enthused, and then say it's a sunny day, we're off now. So we'll aim to bring you all to a close by 5:30. So you may or may not be aware of AECOM. We are a US stock exchange listed company. We have over 87,000 staff serving our clients in over 150 locations, engaging with a collaborative approach with our clients and working on all types of levels of project, from Thames Tideway down to small estates. The residential sector that we work in, our residential expertise, has over 500 people based on our London campus, and our London campus includes St Albans, where I'm based, an office in Croydon, and a larger office in Aldgate in London. And we deliver project management, cost management, architecture, structural engineering, mechanical electrical engineering, and various specialisms. I myself am in one of the specialist teams, often supporting people to do energy and environmental strategies, supporting planning applications, and I'm also the technical lead for a project for BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, called Building for 2050, which is looking at low-cost, low-carbon housing schemes, real-life schemes, and what lessons can be learned to increase the take-up of similar schemes, effectively answering the exam question, why isn't every new home that's built a low-carbon home? And I'm also part of an AECOM team supporting Network Rail's decarbonisation plans at the moment. And I'm embedded with the southern region. I would now like to tell you very briefly who we have, and then ask everybody to introduce themselves. So we have Councillor Paul Scott, who is the Cabinet Lead for Planning and Regeneration within the Council at Croydon. We have Julia Barrett as Head of Sustainability for Wilmot Dixon. We have Jonathan Weston, who is a Project Director for Mixed Use at Stanhope. And we have Rory Bergen, whose role I don't have, so he'll have to tell us himself, who's at HTA. On that note, I think I'll pass to Paul Scott, please.
Hi everybody, yes, I'm Councillor Paul Scott. I'm the Cabinet Member responsible for planning and regeneration, but I'm also a local resident, so ensuring that we have that we achieve this target of zero carbon by 2030 affects me personally in terms of where I live. I'm also an architect, so I'm very much involved from that side of the business in terms of the need for the whole of the construction world to really buy into the delivery of a sustainable future. I assume we're going to just quickly go through now, and then we'll say a little bit more a bit later on. Is that correct, Alison?
Me going on mute doesn't help, does it? Yes, that will be absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay, right.
Can we pass over to Julia, please?
Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name's Julia Barrett and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Wilmot Dixon. I'm normally based in my ivory tower in Letchworth, so I'm joined in the wings, shall we say, by my colleague Richard Pickett, who's Head of Legacy for our London and the South office, which leads on our relationship with the Croydon area. Wilmot Dixon is a privately owned contracting and interior fit-out group working across England and Wales. Founded in 1852, we have a purpose beyond profit to leave a positive legacy in our communities and environment. We've worked in Croydon for many years, delivering over a dozen schools and more recently the new Addington Leisure Centre. Sustainability and climate change is at the heart of what we do. It's led right from the top by our Chief Exec, and we've had Jonathan Porritt, the environmental campaigner, on our board as a non-exec for over 10 years. It won't surprise you, therefore, to know we've had a sustainability strategy since 2013 and have been net zero or carbon neutral in our own operations since 2012. We love working with like-minded customers to deliver exceptional buildings it helps us to innovate by giving us a lens to look through. And we're now coming to the end of that strategy and looking at our new one, and it's quite clear that times have changed. So given that we're already net zero, we're looking to go further and eliminate fossil fuels and generate some of our own renewable energy. But more important and more challenging as a contractor, is that we want all of our projects to be net zero carbon in operation by 2030. In fact, our ambition is that it becomes our standard offer, not optional, not added cost, but if you like our M&S approach, it's not just a building, it's a Wilmot Dixon building. And with that, I'll hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you.
Hi, John Weston from Stanhope. I'm the mixed-use project director responsible for our Ruskin Square development with Schroders in the centre of Croydon. We've been involved for in excess of 15 years in the area and seen it change immeasurably over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. More specifically with Croydon at the moment, we are about to start on site in November with a huge office building over 450,000 square feet, which is 100% pre-let, which has given us an excellent opportunity to become a pioneer for the design for performance measure, which we think is a fantastic approach where we can measure the performance of our buildings over a longer period of time through design, build, commissioning and then operation. So we are going to be one of the first buildings, we think we'll be one of the first 6 buildings in the UK to receive that accreditation. So it's exciting for us as a business, but also for Croydon to really be setting the benchmark for performance of buildings, not just looking at the built form, but how they're actually operated over the long term. So very excited to get that project on the ground soon.
Thank you very much. Rory, please.
Thank you, Alison. So my name is Rory Bergen. I'm a partner at HTA Design LLP. We're a multidisciplinary design practice, mainly architecture, but including sustainability, planning, graphic design, landscape architecture, and other disciplines. And we have been in business for about 50 years. We're a housing specialist. We don't really tackle non-housing related projects, and we've been supporting Brick by Brick in Croydon for several years now on their small sites program, and have a number of projects coming to a conclusion at the moment. And we have recently, with our client Tide Developments, we're just completing the tallest modular volumetric structure in the world opposite East Croydon Tube Station, so 101 George Street, 44 stories and 36 stories, build to rent development for Greystar, an American investment company. So that's being, and that's being built and constructed to the GLA current zero carbon targets. Along with many of our other schemes that we're working on in London at the moment. So we're always interested in talking to others about the process, about how design contributes to this, but also how manufacturing and construction can do its part in sort of lowering the emissions, both off-site in the factories, on the roads on the way to the schemes, and then during the scheme construction and operation.
Thank you very much. Paul, I feel that we'll be coming back to you, so I would like to come back to you and give you a few more minutes to introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was just saying who I was or as saying my piece. So I'm happy to speak now. Obviously, I was assuming that Tony would have been here first to give his sort of keynote intro speech. So I may say a little bit of what he's going to say. Apologies if that's the case. But there is, of course, there's a lot to say on this subject, to be quite honest. I was going to try and take a sort of a holistic sort of viewpoint in terms of what we as the council see and hope will actually happen over the next 10 years, and give some sort of pointers to how we sort of see things sort of developing. But I think it's important to bear in mind that we have an emerging strategy. Mm-hmm. We've had a citizens panel that have looked at the emergency, the climate change emergency crisis. That now sort of moves on to setting up a climate crisis commission, which is starting work over the near future. But there's sort of 5 sort of key sort of areas I want to say a little bit about. So I'll just jump straight into those. Planning for a sustainable future. We are actually at the moment reviewing our Croydon local plan. And there are 2 key sort of issues within that need to be balanced. There's the housing crisis and also, of course, the environmental crisis. And so we're looking at how we can develop sustainable growth and renewal, and really sort of creating opportunities within the local sort of plan level of things, to create opportunities to adapt to the changing needs of society. And frankly, at the end of the day, we can't afford, whichever way you look at it, to destroy our environment, clearly. We all need to ensure that we've got a sustainable, we all need to ensure that sustainable development actually happens and sustainable evolution of the borough actually happens. Otherwise, let's be blunt about it, we might not be here to see the results of it. So we will be looking at strengthening our environmental policies. Obviously, that needs to fit within national and local London perspectives. But we will be looking to do our bit through the development of the plan. We are looking at the development of the new Purley Way quarter, and I think that will create a really exciting opportunity, the transformation of that area to show a more sustainable future. And I think if we see the biggest change across the borough, that's probably the place that can be really focused on that. But we have an opportunity there to actually really very much holistically focus on creating a much better environment, but also creating higher density suburbs. The suburbs are not very sustainable. They never have been very sustainable. Some of them are lovely and great. We want to maintain what's good about them, but we also want to make sure that as the town grows, that the whole of it can be sustainable, that we can support local services, local public transport. So I think that's going to be a major sort of change going forward. I'd like to see as a second point, real positive localism. And I think a sort of urban village renaissance, vibrant local centres that you can walk to, importantly, or cycle to. Really sort of developing sort of local sort of interaction, places where people can actually meet locally. Because I think one of the key things for the future is less vehicular traffic. So it is more walking, more cycling, more possibly scooting, smart public transport, sort of small scale public transport that can come in, possibly looking forward to drone deliveries, replacing the white vans that are now massively increasing the amount of traffic, setting aside the current circumstances, delivering small packages across the world now, but particularly focusing in Croydon. Creating livable streets where cars are far less dominant, closing rat runs, turning our streets into places to meet, and environmental places from the wider sort of sense that people can live slightly more local lives and support their local services. And I think that's an important part of the sort of holistic sort of approach we need to be taking. Flexibility, and a few sort of key points on that. We are knocking down lots of buildings that we put a lot of carbon, a lot of energy into just a few years ago. And we keep doing this. We build concrete structures, steel structures, and then knock them down for a new use. We need to be developing much more flexible, adaptable buildings that can be used and changed for the future. We need changing planning policies that allow for things, simple things like accommodating for heat pumps on top of residential buildings, probably on the top, but wherever. And how we can wean ourselves off our love affair with the car in terms of planning policies as well. Again, controversial, but important. Also sort of retrofitting existing buildings, because whatever we do in the built environment over the next 10 years, it will only replace a very small proportion or increase a small proportion the number of vehicles. So I think number of buildings in the borough. So we very much need to be focusing on what it is we're going to do with the existing buildings, and homes, and businesses. A greener future, and I'm getting through this enormously. A greener future is the third, I think, point. We want to create a real meaningful green grid across the borough. Which will create fantastic opportunities for carbon offsetting. We want to extend the countryside in various ways, urban, realistic ways, from the south, from the countryside in the south up to the big parks in the north, and use that as a real opportunity to help us all reconnect with nature. We must remember that we are animals too, and we've forgotten that because we think we've become too smart, and yet we're possibly one of the first race creature on the earth that's putting the whole of the ecosystem in danger. So maybe we aren't as smart as we like to think we are, but let's hope we're smart enough to avoid our own extinction, because it can get that serious. Reforestation, I think I'd like to see by 2030 a lot more trees planted, not only on streets, but also taking some of the open land that we've got now and creating new forests for the future that can absorb a lot of carbon that we are producing. And also potentially local food production as well. At the moment we have this ridiculous situation across the world where we fly strawberries at huge embedded carbon sort of levels in planes across the world. It's stupid. We need to be focusing on how we can actually be more go back to sort of a more naturalistic sort of view of how we do things. And also, I think finally, the final key point is embracing change. We need to be, as a society, as leaders in society, allowing people to and educating people to understand the depth of the problem that we're actually in, which I think most people now are grasping, but actually take firm leadership as well to make the changes that we actually need. People are becoming more and more acceptable of seeing lots of solar panels on roofs, for example. Local power generation, I think, is going to be really important. Again, to sort of keep it sort of local. How do we accommodate the types of plant that we're going to need for the future, but also make sure that there isn't too much of it, so our buildings can actually deal with hotter weather without lots of people deciding to put air conditioning into their own homes, which would be an absolute disaster. Different ways of moving around, or, as I touched on earlier on, positively staying put, being more local, creating far less waste. So let's, again, sort of a how will Croydon look sort of perspective, not so many bins, because we won't have created so much waste in the first place, I think is really important. But also in terms of smaller scale, probably smaller scale new businesses focusing on reuse and regeneration, remaking things. And also, why not have more wild verges and things like that? Let's actually allow the spaces, the green spaces we've got now, to be more green rather than mowing everything down all the time. So our vision, just very briefly, is basically a healthier borough, a sustainable borough, cleaner air, stronger communities, which means that mental health will actually help to be addressed as well, fitter walkers, cyclists, happier wildlife, active bees, bird song replacing the drone of heavy traffic. It's a big ambition. We've got a lot of change to make, and I'm sure that everybody here will have will be able to add to that. But we all need to be part of this. We all live on this planet, and we all need to make it more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I am going to ask the question as to whether we have our keynote speaker yet. I'm going to ask Bonnie that question. Aha!
As if by magic.
As if by magic.
Hi, folks.
Good afternoon, Councillor Tony Newman. We are ready for your keynote speech if you're ready to deliver it for us.
Right, that's 5 seconds ago. Apologies, I've just come from 900 people on a mental health summit run by SLAM across South London. So pleased to join you here. So, how many people we got on this call?
162, as far as I can see.
Right. Well, I mean, look, just to say, I think it's a fantastic event to be doing. What have we heard so far? I don't want to repeat things.
Okay, we've heard who we all are as panelists.
Yeah.
Myself as the chair, and we've heard a vision of a zero carbon Croydon from your colleague Councillor Paul Scott. But what we haven't done yet, but I don't necessarily require you to do this at all, is to say that we're going to be, because of the panelists we got, focused a bit more around development, regeneration and buildings. But really what we would like you to do is just give us an introduction onto what will a zero carbon Croydon look like and how you think that developers, contractors, consultants, etc. can all help in delivering this vision.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And we're in sort of two worlds here, aren't we? So pre-COVID, you know, we had put in place a climate crisis commission in Croydon. We had as a thread running through our manifesto 2 years ago as an administration that we were elected on sustainability, and it actually ran through the core of everything we've been doing. We actually launched that commission, I think, well, I should always remember, I think it was on the 19th of March, effectively the day before all but lockdown started. And the world on one level has changed dramatically, but on another it hasn't. And I think a carbon-free, sustainable Croydon for me is, you know, there's going to be, alongside this health crisis now, a massive economic downturn as well. We genuinely believe that Croydon is probably going to be as well placed as anywhere, for reasons many of you know, to recover from that, given the opportunity relatively quickly. But I'm aware that, you know, we're working against the backdrop here with 8 million workers in the country currently furloughed, and how we take this agenda forward whilst many families out there are wondering if they have a job or whether they will still have a job. Is part of the challenge. But what I think to cut to the main point I want to really make ahead of some discussion is for me the COVID crisis and the ongoing and incoming economic crisis make this agenda even more important than ever. I think we are absolutely determined that we want to see a recovery in every sense, to be a sustainable green recovery. We want to make sure that in terms of Croydon's strength, in terms of transport, sustainable transport links, that they are both reinforced. And if you were to take examples, perhaps like a tram tracks expanded further, and I know Network Rail were talking about the launch of the new East Croydon station the other day in terms of vital transport infrastructure. I think in terms of the new jobs coming to Croydon, in terms of IT, a lot of hospitality where there's huge challenges at the moment. We only opened the Fairfield Halls in September, and we're going to have to reopen it again sometime soon. So in terms of a Croydon where we want people to live, work and play, zero carbon for me has got to run alongside a sustainable agenda. That means sustainability in every sense of the word. This is about sustainable jobs, sustainable quality of life, sustainable housing, affordable high quality housing, and a sustainable air to breathe. I mean, the irony, a bitter irony of COVID is the air quality in London is probably now the best it's been for 150 years. You know, will we be able to do anything at all to keep it like that? Or will the new normal see us rush back to how it was? Let's hope it doesn't have to be so. So I think this is an absolutely welcome and vital moment to be having this conversation, both in terms of how we try to get the economy nationally, locally and regionally back on track, but the steps that we're going to take going forward and the influence we have. And what we have in Croydon is still a huge opportunity, despite the significant growth of recent years, to influence change in a way that perhaps hasn't been, you know, not many people in too many generations get that opportunity. So I'll throw in one other word which normally livens up any conversation: Westfield. For me, it's not about, you know, we've had some very encouraging conversations with Westfield in the last couple of weeks, but how we redesign the metropolitan centre, the city centre of Croydon now, in terms of zero carbon, in terms of sustainability. Even if you had all the choices and all the money at your fingertips, would you want to do it like it was originally conceived 10 years ago? I don't think that's where the retail market is. I don't think that's where we would want to be, and probably it's not where we're going to be. So I think this discussion can go down to the sort of micro level of what we want to see a sustainable carbon-free Croydon look like, and how we can influence that locally and in district centres, round to the huge infrastructure projects in the centre of Croydon, and how we all come together and work together on that. I could probably talk a lot longer, but I would rather hear other people speak as well. So I hope that just gives you a flavour of where we're coming from as administration. I'm sure Paul's set that out as well. But we're absolutely doubling down on our commitments at this point to a sustainable Croydon, and we're not retreating to another place, because, as I've already said, we actually now believe, in light of what's happened in the last 3 months, it's more important than ever.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that great context and commitment. Well, I think most of the people on this call would agree that we want a sustainable green economic recovery stroke avoidance of more of the worst of a recession, and all the benefits, or at least most of the benefits that have been accrued from not much traffic on the roads, and the improved air quality, and people getting into a habit of going for a walk as a leisure activity rather than going shopping as a leisure activity. So we've seen amazing changes, and I think we've also all understood better what an emergency situation actually means. So we've you know, embraced the term climate emergency without really necessarily taking on board what an emergency means in terms of different habits and lifestyles, and suddenly we've had that come home to us very firmly about what that might mean and how personal the impacts of an emergency are. And people are starting to value green space a lot more as well, particularly where they've got it themselves in their own gardens, but also the opportunity to go out and enjoy nature, and not just parks, but footpaths, bridleways, etc. I was first of all going to ask Paul, but I think he's already done this, to say, what does Croydon mean by zero carbon? But is it worth just, rather than a sort of vision, being a little more quantifiable around what you might mean by zero carbon or carbon neutral, and that it's not just zero carbon, but more a net carbon approach, where it's okay and acceptable to have some carbon emissions if over the course of a year, or within the context of carbon offsets and planting and whatever you've still got, you've got a means to mitigate against what you might have emitted. Do you want to tell us a little bit, if you would, around what it means by being zero carbon, and then we can come around some of the other panelists to just make sure that we all understand what we're talking about before we get into a bit more detail.
Sorry, was that Alison? I missed part of what you were saying there at the beginning. You went silent.
Oh, okay. Well, I said, although you'd given us a wonderful vision that was all encompassing, including localism and transport and those sort of aspects, perhaps we can be a little bit more specific about what Croydon means by zero carbon, just to make sure that we're all together in the same view of what it is in relation to buildings, and that it's okay to have an amount of energy still. There might be carbon offsets, there might be tree planting. You might look that it's not all delivered within the red line boundary of Croydon or whatever. So just to talk us a little bit more through what that means, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, we need to be pragmatic. I think we recognise that. So we do need, issues such as carbon offsetting, and that's why, as I was saying earlier on, I think we need a holistic approach to this. We can be very, very dogmatic and say, right, every single building needs to be absolutely zero carbon, and we're going to really sort of struggle to do that probably. But if we can, through reforestation, improvement of our green spaces, greener streets, literally greener streets, use different sorts of ways of actually achieving the same effect, I think that is the appropriate way to move forward. Because let's face it, the whole industry, the construction industry, is not geared up at this stage. The world is not geared up at this stage to go zero carbon like that.
No, I agree.
And so I say we need to be pragmatic. We need to be quite hard-nosed about it as well. On one level, we need to be driving this forward, but we do need pragmatic solutions.
Lovely, thank you. Julia, would you like to say something because of Wilmot Dixon, where you are now, how you're delivering zero carbon, what you might have experienced elsewhere, some tips for all of us on it?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. It was interesting hearing Councillor Scott there. It made me think of my favourite quote of the moment in dealing with this crisis, which is, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good." Often attributed to Voltaire. And I think, I've been with Wilmot Dixon now for coming up for 8 years, so back in 2012. And, back in the day, it was all about our own footprint and demonstrating what we could do. And we used to talk about making the business case and what paid, and that, if you invest, what will you realise? And we did, exactly that. We understood our own footprint. We measured it, we understood the root causes, and then we tackled the bigger ones. And, that it was as simple. And I think that the thing I was thinking about preparing for today was, so much of this is about behaviour change, doing things differently, not expecting things to carry on in the way that they always have done. So I think it was Councillor Scott referred to travel and transport. When I was in local government, we were moving from 2 cars per dwelling to 1 car, and and now we're talking about no cars. So don't underestimate the challenge of changing behaviour and people's understanding, and making the messaging really simple. And I suppose, as I say, back to the beginning of our journey, you can imagine building sites, and we do manage to get some electric power on there. But there used to be not the impetus, because we could get diesel generators on site, and they would generate your power. And obviously, diesel's not very efficient, and also air quality issues. And that was one of our first messages: get off diesel, get off diesel, get off diesel. And now we're setting up all our sites on natural renewable energy, and making, aiming to make all of them fossil fuel free. We won't be perfect in the beginning, but it's a simple message that our people and our supply chain partners understand. So, and we know that will deliver a big win, and it will deliver other wins as well, which I won't go into now. But yeah, behaviour change, simple messages, go for the low-hanging fruit. Don't think you've got to have worked everything out at the start. Go for those early wins, and success breeds success.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to come to Jonathan now. Would you like to add into that around zero carbon and how to start to address it?
I think education is a there's a sort of common thread, and education is a huge part of it. And for me, that's it's coming from the bottom up. Actually, our tenants and the people who are occupying the buildings we produce are wanting, driving this sustainability agenda, but that education process is going through the contracting market, the subcontracting market, but also how people, we sort of picked up common threads, but how people are actually using these buildings. We as individuals have to change how we use buildings and expect from them. And I think, we're on quite an interesting journey because it's not a local issue, it's been driven across the globe. We think, putting in place measures that measure performance as you go through the process will help feed that educational process. So, for example, the first building we delivered on Ruskin, we're going back in there to do a post-occupancy evaluation to try and drive efficiencies into the new building. And I think the more we as an industry can share that and not sort of keep it within our own stable, I think is how we can get there a lot quicker. And that's on the industry, certainly our side of the industry, in terms of performance criteria, publishing that process. And I think, we've got to be open. I think we've also not got to be shy of where things aren't quite working, because that's where you're going to learn the lessons. So, and ultimately we can only deliver so much within a red line. I think something else that's been picked up, and it's really interesting to hear the drives from Croydon, because I think ultimately, people want to see that, offsetting locally if they can as a first stop. I don't think people want to go back into the dark days of carbon trading and the like. I think, it's part of that education process, and that's the legislative side, which, from the local authority, the GLA and national government, that's where they really have to drive that legislative side, and the industry has to sort of start coming together. So, it is multifaceted. I think we're trying to, picking up Julia's point, that the industry itself is reacting very positively to it, because ultimately it's being driven by those end users. So, but I think the openness and education of the whole sort of food chain is a key part of it.
Thank you. I would agree with that. Certainly from one of my projects, the observation, that the skills question that government might ask. They're thinking around contractors, maybe use of modular, installing unfamiliar technologies such as heat pumps in residential units, whatever. But it goes back to, did the design team have the right skills so that the fabric first approach was properly delivered by the engineering team by putting less kit in, and maybe even having a confidence that you don't need a radiator in this room, this room, and this room. So you actually put less kit in, and then start to reap the benefits of the reduction in capital cost. Otherwise, it's the belt and braces approach means that you're not really making the capital cost savings, and you're perhaps confusing your occupants as well. And then when you move towards low temperature heating and having oversized radiators, you can look at a house and think, I thought this was a low carbon house, but the radiators are bigger than the ones in the house that I'm in currently. And that's around messaging and education and explaining why, and that actually you might not need, you could probably turn most of them off, and all those sorts of things, which then lead into the more complex approach of perhaps time of use tariffs and why that might make a difference, and how it helps a larger energy system to distribute load across the day rather than at peak times, etc. But I can see that Rory is keen to speak, so let's hear what Rory's got to say.
Well, I think that there are two sort of points I suppose I would like to make. One is that leadership matters, I think, a lot. We have sadly seen government kind of come and go in this whole sphere, showing enthusiasm for technology one year and then dropping it from policy to next. You know, all of that is I think is very unhelpful. Whereas having a strategy for Croydon for a decade is really helpful, because that enables everybody to kind of get behind something, to understand what the trajectory is, to develop some not too complicated principles, some fairly simple principles of operation, and then actually drive them through across the whole sector. Because, you know, the real gains are not from an individual high performing project. You know, of course we love to talk about our individual high performing projects, but actually the real benefits are when you have hundreds of pretty well performing projects.
Yeah.
You know, we don't need individual small beautiful exemplars. We need a high performance level across the entire sector. And to get there, what we need is shared goals and collaboration. So we need to be sharing each other's experience, so that, you know, instead of people making the same mistakes on multiple projects, that we share our mistakes, you know, as well as the things that we've got right. And I think sharing mistakes is the one thing that this sector is really terrible at. You know, nobody likes to share mistakes. The insurance side of the business is seriously unhelpful about all of that. You know, so they'd prefer us to bury them rather than to talk about them. So I think there are some strategic things that we as a sector need to think about to develop. I also, and I noticed there have been a couple of questions about this in the chat. About the embodied energy that goes into buildings. I think that's, you know, for us, that's a really important question. But we are all at a very early stage of understanding this. You know, we're pretty convinced that offsite construction, moving things to factories, is cleaner, more efficient, you know, less energy hungry. But in order for that to really work, we need to maximize it. We need to spread the word. We need to use it across many projects and not just one or two exemplars.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to do a couple more before we go on to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. So, well, maybe we partly addressed this, which is what are the biggest challenges for developers, contractors and consultants? Maybe almost sharing some of the experiences here. I'm with you completely, Rory. I've always thought it's much more useful to have a series of worst practice guides than best practice guides, but nobody ever seems to want to sponsor those. And what I would say also is, in our Building for 2050 project, you know, part of the being selected were people willing to share what they were doing in terms of low cost, low carbon designs. And we found the SMEs much more willing than the major house builders who were much more protective of IP, of anything new they were doing, much more nervous that if something wasn't 100% brilliant, they wouldn't want that in the public domain. And maybe it's because of share listing or whatever, I don't know, but the SMEs had the more open approach in terms of participating in the scheme, and the more innovative solutions, to be honest. So should we just go round, and I'm going to start with Jonathan again, if I may. What do we think the biggest challenges are for developers and contractors and consultants? So I shall go round you, if I may.
Well, there's numerous. I think, you know, there's the age-old challenge of you know, cost versus versus revenue to make these processes balance up. But I think you know, it's good. As I said previously, really, it's the education side of it. You know, we operate probably a little bit uniquely than most. We have direct ties into our contractor network, but also all our subcontractors. And for us, it's driving behaviours through that whole process towards that sort of common goal ultimately. That for me is the biggest challenge. It's very easy to break the chain quite quickly when you go into certain types of building contract, where different businesses might have different drivers. And I think, you know, the approach we've tried to take with design for performance, which means, you know, those the various people through the design and build process are tied in at ultimately sort of 3 years after a building is finished. You know, because what we want to do is make sure that when we hand over buildings moving forward, you know, ultimately what we say, what it says on the tin is delivered 3 years later. And I think, again, I know it's sort of hopping on about that education process, but that is part of the real challenge is, you know, we can, at the start of a design process, we can have an aspiration as a team. We've then got to deliver that through the build process, but more importantly, people who take over those buildings and the individuals who take them over, you know, really need to understand how best to operate those buildings and manage them and use them. And I think, you know, that for me is one of the biggest challenges is that behavioural change of people, really, and that's right the way through the process. And I think if you can get some alignment, you know, through our, you know, again, through the bits we control, through that design process, that's a huge huge fillet for the process, really, where you've got that behaviour and alignment on a project, where ultimately people are pulling in the right direction. But it's not I think few people, you know, it's not an immediate process. There will be some exemplar projects out there which will go and achieve net carbon zero, but I think we certainly are on a step process to as we build through and a learning process to get there. You know, similar targets over on 2030 is become the sort of new line in the sand, and I think, you know, the way we're going to do that is through that process of learning and you know, being honest about some of the mistakes we make, and learn from that wider group. Yeah,
no, I agree. And you know, when you think, well, is it in the FM contractor's best interest to do as little as possible, or to be more proactive and say, well, we've observed that you've got panel heaters in your stairwell with manual control, how about we put some thermostatic control on them for you? Or, you know, we've observed that the energy load overnight is looking a bit high, how about we investigate this for you, rather than, you know, how about we change as few filters as possible and hope that nobody really notices, you know. So it's a mindset change to wanting to be proactive and seeing that that's a good business opportunity still, but that you're supporting the bigger aim of making somebody use their building much more efficiently. Because I'm still horrified by the amount of waste in operation that is observable. As I say, there could be panel heaters on in stairwells in June, and I'm sure that's not necessary. I'm really sure it's not in office buildings or whatever. Right, okay, so that was developers, and if we now go to contractors, Julia.
Thanks, Alison. Yes, we're a tier 1 contractor. We're not a developer, and we're not a house builder. You're not a volume house builder, just to get that in there, given that you've given a bit of a slating up front there.
Observation, not slating. Observation. Well,
that's how they may beg to differ, but I think that the important thing being a contractor, and Jonathan talked about working with contractors, is that we're often led by the customer. And, you know, they often come with a very fixed mindset about what they want. And, you know, in my opening piece, I said, we like to work with like-minded customers who think in the same way as we do, or actually are open to influence and open to having those conversations early up front. As with any type of project, whichever field you're in, the earlier that you can think about issues, the easier they are to implement, and less expensive to do that. And I think one of the challenges we always have, and I haven't got a golden bullet for it, you know, shout out to to everybody listening, but the real opportunity for us is that whole life cycle costing. Mm-hmm. So when is it worth spending a little bit more on the fabric of the building, perhaps great insulation standards, great you know, lighting, air quality, to save those costs in operation and maintenance later on? You know, design out those heaters you're talking about, Alison, making sure that, you know, you've got a great building up front. And ultimately, you know, we've delivered a number of passive house buildings, and, you know, they're very high standard building, but what they do is mean you invest in the fabric of the building, but then your operating costs in terms of energy and heating are very low for a really high quality environment. One of the easiest ways for us to deliver that is to come up with pre-designed solutions. So to come up with those standard products, so you can have one of these as, you know, we've done all the thinking, we know the parts it's built of, we've selected the materials, we know if we put them together in a certain way, they're going to perform excellently in use. And, you know, if we're really clever about it, we can design them so that once they've finished their life, perhaps as a community medical hub, that perhaps they turn into a residential block or an education hub or something else. So making sure we're thinking about the long-term use of a building and reusing it rather than having to rip something down and build it all over again. But ultimately, you know, we need these sorts of discussions to stop being special. It just needs to be the way we do things. And the more, you know, we start driving these exemplary standards, and our supply chain partners, so we have people that come and work for us, they understand that those standards are just what we expect, then it stops being special. There stops being a price premium. It becomes the new norm. And just, you know, I can't agree too strongly with Jonathan about that performance in use. We're great at, you know, as an industry at designing buildings, coming up with those design standards. Quite often they are theoretical, and the real test is how are they performing in operation? Have we built what we promised to build? And are people using it in the way that we expected? And it isn't just about the customer. It isn't just their fault. There is very much a partnership there. It's something we believe very strongly in, closing this gap in performance, making sure that what we've said you'll get is what you'll get. Now, it's an elephant in the room. It's our VW scandal as a sector. Perhaps I'm being too strong, but I do feel strongly about it. And I think there are ways, and customers, you know, can think about how they want to collaborate and drive that agenda, whether it's about standards, we you know, heard about neighbours and other performance standards, or whether actually it's some sort of contract performance. I'll probably get fired for saying that now, but there you go. It's been nice knowing you. But I do think there are ways. If we really want to drive change, we need to innovate. We need to do things differently.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And over to Rory.
Thank you. So a few things come to mind. So one is that we as a practice have adopted the RIBA 2030 challenge. So that is like the zero carbon agenda. It's a 10-year program with a sort of a tiered steps of improvement in performance. So we are now tracking the performance of buildings that we submit for planning and that we complete during that period, and we'll be reporting back to the RIBA annually on that. And that sort of initiative helps to bring focus to the practice. You know, as Julia was saying, that it sort of moves away from being a kind of an occasional thing to being the everyday thing. So every project is treated in the same way, and we look at every project with the same lens. So it's very helpful to have that long-term trajectory with sort of regular checkpoints, and to be sure that 6 months or a year after you've completed a building, that somebody checks and see how it's performing, and probably goes back again for a couple of years afterwards. No need to do a sort of forensic analysis unless there's something wrong. So it's just doing a very simple light check of building performance, and then assessing, you know, the impact of the information you get. And at the moment, you know, it comes back to that problem the industry have of not really sharing problems. Yeah. We don't really we don't really want to look for them either. So that's a sort of behaviour change, I think, across the sector. And you know, the GLA are leading a little bit on that, and maybe that's something that Croydon could also push in their internal policies to make sure that you know, developments do actually go back and check to see whether or not they did what they said it was going to do. I mean, on that front, we are pretty convinced, and the anecdotal evidence we've got from our prefabricated projects is that they're performing better than other similar projects, and we've got a plan to do some research in more detail on those this year. when we come out of the other side of the pandemic. But I think too there is an attitude issue on the client side, where some clients naturally care about the long-term proposition. So the developers who are going to own and manage and run the buildings have one set of attitudes. Those who are going to build them speculatively and then sell them on have another attitude. That's still a tricky issue to navigate. There have been a couple of questions I've seen on the chat about refurbishment versus demolition, and I think that it's I'm very wary of taking a blanket position. Of course, we need to reduce the embodied carbon in construction. Of course, we need to tackle all these things. But we have inherited some terrible buildings, and making them last another 10 or 20 years isn't always the best thing to do. What you have to do is you have to do a whole life carbon analysis, look at the project for a 50, 60, 80-year lifespan, and then come to a conclusion. I'm not a fan of sort of blanket positions when it comes to things like that, because we do some work on housing estates where they were built in the sort of the excitement of the 60s and concrete panel construction, and there are really not places that people should be living in and bringing their children up in. So we have to accept that there are some things which have a cost that we as a society need to pay. In other areas, other building types, then the answer is a different one.
Thank you very much. We have a large number of questions, and I've only got the top filtered ones. But before I go to those, because I think that's what people have joined for, to be able to put forward some of their own perspectives. And when we go through these, because it's, would all the panellists or whatever, I will be asking you to be succinct. But before I move on to that, would you, Councillor Scott, like to say anything? And then I'll come on to you, Councillor Newman. So was there anything else you want to add around the biggest challenges for developers, contractors and consultants? Sorry, Paul.
Not really. I think I think I've said already that we want to take a flexible approach. We want to work with developers, with their teams, to make sure that we can actually achieve what's practical. We want to take a flexible approach because we know this isn't going to be very easy to achieve. We want to work with people. We've also, obviously, with our own developer, brick by brick, pushing them to well on the way with this, to deliver very sustainable schemes themselves. So that's one of our key contributions, and obviously, as a commissioner beyond brick by brick, to make sure that the schemes that we are procuring are as sustainable as they can be. One of the things I do want to just pick up on, though, I think is really important in terms of homes, is ensuring that homes in the future are actually usable in the way that is envisaged in the design, to keep the sustainability, or to achieve the level of sustainability that they were designed to achieve. Because one of the things that I think there are real problems with putting new types of systems in homes is people that then use them, that live in those homes, actually understanding how to use and how to get the best out of the systems that have been put in. Because I think there's a real failing on that very often. And I think it's one of the things we all need to get better at. Thank you.
I completely agree with that, and going back to the education piece where I said the design team aren't always as skilled as they could be. Those doing handovers, those writing manuals, etc., are definitely not always as skilled as they could be. And thank you, Rory, for mentioning the new Be Seen aspect of the GLA. The draft guidance is already out, where you will have to predict your energy performance for 5 years after handover and then report on it. Before picking up wider questions, I did promise Councillor Newman, do you have anything you'd like to add at this point? And at the moment you're on mute.
Thank you. A lot of trouble unmuting. Just to say, it would be good to get to the questions, because I really welcome the commitment from everyone that I've heard speak so far to this agenda.
Lovely, thank you. Right, so I am going to go to one that I have been told has been highly voted. I will ask probably just one or two of you to answer this one. So if you come off mute, I'll know that you're keen to answer it. How would you encourage the reuse of buildings over demolition or new build to reduce carbon footprint? And that's a popular question. So, Councillor Newman.
Crikey, no, I only left it unmuted there by mistake. I feel there's others better qualified to answer it. No, but it is an important point because I've heard others raise it as well. So I don't know the technical stuff behind it, and I heard that point earlier about there's some very poor buildings out there as well. There are some very creative people, and there are some buildings that perhaps 10 years ago the instinct would have been just to demolish them. And as long as, from my point of view, and Paul's, I'm sure, the assurance that we're looking at all the options before rushing into anything is always part of this process. Perhaps in a way it wasn't in the rush of a few years ago. Then we support that, but I do actually also take that point that there is there's some crap out there that needs to come down, if I can put it that way.
Thank you for being so succinct. Right, I'm looking to see who's unmuted and gone, me, I went to answer, and it's Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. Let's go to you, and then we'll go to Rory.
Yeah, I'd just like to, I think one of the questions there at least mentioned the Whitgift Westfield development.
Yeah.
Firstly, I think the same questioner mentioned that the fact that there's no nighttime economy in Croydon. Well, come to Croydon when things are normal. There's a lot, and we're looking to develop a lot more. So we do have a plan for that. But one of the things that we are talking to the Croydon Partnership, the joint developers, hopefully coming forward sometime in the relatively near future on Whitgift Centre, is the potential for reuse of a lot of the buildings. They were taking the approach that they were just going to clear the entire site and start again, whereas actually there are some very good structures there that could be used, and I know that they are already looking at that very, very closely. So we'd be very supportive of that, because particularly where you've got office buildings, which are basically open floor plates, they do have the flexibility to be, decent homes, hotels, the reuse of some of the retail spaces on that development there. So I think that's a good example of where, in this case, we can encourage. We don't own the site, it's private developers, but we can encourage them and support them if that's the approach that they're actually going to take. Also, suburban intensification is a big issue. A lot of people don't understand, I think, the depth of the housing crisis we're in. We have seen a planning committee over recent months some really good examples of existing buildings, existing houses reused and significantly extended to be partially rebuilt and converted into flats. And actually, as people tussle with the idea of how new developments fit into an existing character, keeping and reusing part of the building that's already there, it has an environmental sense, but obviously also has a continuation of the original character as well. So we very much promote that, and we've seen some really innovative and interesting schemes coming forward. So we're very keen to see more of that in the future.
Lovely, thank you. Rory?
So I guess my stance is sort of partly what I said earlier about making sure that you do the analysis over the long term. I understand the argument as to the reuse of buildings. I would say that our experience as sort of housing specialists is that buildings that are going to provide good homes for people over the long term are our priority. And so you have to balance the environmental side, the carbon emissions. You have to balance the financial side, and you have to balance the human side. So it's sort of where is the building? How close is it to amenities? Is it the appropriate use now? One thing that concerns us is the reuse of commercial buildings under the permitted development rights for conversion to residential, which on the one hand sounds like a great story for carbon emission reductions, but if you look into the quality of many of those schemes, the result is substandard housing for people who will suffer years of rather poor quality life in homes with rather low amenity and rather low living standards. So, like I said, balance is key. You've got to look at the carbon emissions as one part of the scales, which also involves the financial, the environmental, and the human issues, and look at them over the long period that's been considered.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to pick another question here. Retrofitting existing houses. This is particularly, or existing properties, it's particularly targeted at you, Paul. How can we persuade homeowners to improve their home? Does the panel think homeowners should have to pay for work themselves, or should there be sizable grant funding? How do we balance maintaining the character of older buildings against making them more energy efficient, especially solid wall properties?
Well, yeah, I just start by saying that really what we need is scalable solutions.
Yep.
We touched on earlier on about you can have a few icons, but they aren't going to solve the problem. Most of the homes that most of us are in at the moment, actually, are still going to be homes in 100 years' time, probably. So actually, finding solutions to allow people to be able to upgrade their homes, existing homes, I think is really important. And I would very much urge the government to make funding available for doing just that. Grants would be an obvious one, but also developing simple packages that people can use. I mean, most people who live in a Victorian terraced house live in exactly the same type of Victorian terrace house with exactly the same issues as the next street along and 2 miles away and 100 miles away. So actually having sensible solutions that can actually work for those types of properties is really important. And actually we've taken, in most cases, the sort of the easy solutions in terms of filling in cavities that weren't filled originally, from the sort of earlier cavity schemes. Now the big issue is the places with solid brick walls, and particularly given that brickwork is a key sort of feature of the local area. So overcladding, frankly, to be honest, I don't think I've seen a good example aesthetically of an overclad brickwork scheme. We've got some where some have been done in the street and some haven't, and it can look really, really poor. It's difficult because then the next turn around is, well, how do you persuade people then to reduce the size of their rooms by insulating the inside? This is about education. It's about making people understand that actually the disbenefits of investing in their homes to make them more environmentally friendly are actually probably very, very positive. And I think we will see much more of that as fuel bills continue to rise rapidly. So I think there needs to be a sort of carrot and stick sort of approach, but also, I say, particularly balanced with the education, making people aware of the need to make these sorts of changes.
I think as you say, with the change from maybe a gas boiler to an electric heat pump, most people wouldn't be willing to afford the bills that they're going to get with the electric heat pump, but also will struggle to say, how am I going to pay £20,000 to get my house externally insulated and upgraded and everything else? And it moves towards more a heating as a service model, whereby you're not the one making the initial capital outlay. You are. It's almost like a PCP approach where you've got a fixed cost every month and somebody else is funding the capital, and that's really what the energy sprung approach is around, and they are trialling that now in London. And you can get a brick slip option for an overcladding if that's a particular passion. And the whole point of that is to be able to retrofit a house very quickly with the residents still in situ, so changing a lot of the problems that were experienced in the past where you needed to do rolling decant for social housing programs and issues like that. Okay, Jonathan, did you want to say something particular?
The only thing I was going to, I mean, I think it's probably not, it's not quite a link point, but the future adaptability of the building, whether it's residential or office, from this point forward is a huge test for the industry. I think, what we don't want to be doing is making the same mistakes of pulling down some buildings we're putting up now in 20 years time. And I think that's arguably one of the biggest challenges we do have. A lot of people are making assumptions on some of the building materials we potentially might use. But I think, interestingly, the whole COVID crisis may well put that under a lot more focus as to how much, even buildings we delivered 3, 4, 5 years ago can adapt to what might be a slightly different environment over the next 3 or 4 years. And I do think, as a challenge to the industry, whether it's, sort of multi-generational housing on one end of the spectrum or a grade A office at the other end of the spectrum, the true challenge of a sustainable building is it is still reused in 25, 50, 75 years time. And I think, that is the challenge to us as developers, investors and occupiers to make sure, it's not down to over engineering, but actually being, thinking creatively about that longer term issue and not just immediate sort of profit. And I think, that ultimately is the underlying fact that this sort of new sustainability agenda is going to drive. So
brilliant, thank you. Right, I've got lots of questions here and I'm going to come to a few of them, so I'll do my best. But I'm going to put this one again to Councillor Paul Scott, if I may. 10 years ago, Croydon Council were looking at significant district heating network to link across the city urban area for existing and new developments, which is of course a way of providing low carbon heat to the likes of Victorian terraced houses. I'm not aware this has happened. What about the opportunity for heat from the Beddington Energy from Waste site to supply Croydon with low carbon heat?
Well, that's a good idea. The last point, and it's something that is being looked at. There are some serious technical issues with actually achieving that, but one of the main ones is the cost as well. But that is being considered, and actually we have actually got an allocated site under and next to the flyover for an energy centre. That could potentially link in to the Beddington Waste to Energy Centre. But there are other options as well. The trouble is, a real big issue here is the cost of actually enabling these kinds of schemes. We are requiring all major town centre developments to be enabled to be able to link in to a future district heating systems. And we would like to see that come forward, but at the moment we're not in a position to make that happen now. But as I say, studies are still underway in terms of what we can do, but it needs to be a deliverable scheme, basically. Lovely,
thank you. Okay, there was one thing I just wanted to confirm actually. Somebody said I might want to listen to all of this again. How might I be able to? To which Bonnie, as our expert organiser, said. It is available to view on the Real Estate Live YouTube channel and both the Developer Croydon and Croydon Construction Excellent Club websites within the next day or so. So, Julia, you and I who think we've said something that could get us sacked, it's been recorded and we won't be able to deny it, is all I can say to that. Right, I'm going to pick another one here. Croydon is mostly suburban sprawl. I can't say it. Suburban sprawl. That was a mean thing to write down, wasn't it? In terms of being able to pronounce it. Could densification draw people away from the fringes and encroachment on green spaces and reclaim the fringe suburbs or strategic spaces throughout the suburbs for natural spaces? So I think you were suggesting that in the first place, actually. So you've kind of, you introduced this, Paul, saying that this was something that you were definitely looking at. But actually, if I go to another one which says, I reiterate the fact there is no quality public space within the town centre. and there's concern that this isn't highlighted enough in the local plan. So how can it be? The site where Taberner House was, for example, is now extremely crowded and will not contribute to a present environment. So they're kind of hand in hand of how do you densify the suburbs, bring people along with that vision, create and preserve the public open space more on the fringes, and then perhaps be able to create more in the centre as well. I'll throw that one over to you.
Well, if we start in the centre, Queen's Gardens is to be transformed and massively improved as part of the Taberner House redevelopment scheme. So that is coming forward, and in fact, actually, Queen's Gardens will become bigger. Linking across the road, the new, we're now calling it Fairfield, restoring the old name. The public realm scheme there is developing really, really excitingly. We will hopefully have the Queen Square development coming forward via R&F's development opposite the town hall as well. So those three spaces will actually link through. Plus, we're also looking at very significant improvements to Park Hill Park, and of course, Wandle Park is a fabulous, fabulous park already. So those public spaces are being looked at. We're also, obviously wanting the main streets within the centre of Croydon to be upgraded as well, linking those spaces together. And we are again encouraging the developers on the Whitgift Centre to think of more better urban design solutions for their rethink of the Westfield. So centrally, I think we're on that case. We're moving that forward. It does take time. These things do not happen overnight or over a matter of a few years. But there's some really major moves already happening. In terms of intensification, well, we had the consultation on our issues and options paper for the local plan review. I'm not surprised at all, and I'm pleased in very many respects that a clear outcome of that consultation was that people recognised that that instead of actually taking more greenbelt land to build the new homes that we require, that actually that we will have densification, intensification, or what the Secretary of State is calling gentle densification of the suburbs coming forward, which means that we can protect the open spaces that we have, enhance those open spaces further, ensure that we get high quality development through the continued growth of the suburbs in terms of the growth of the number of homes within those suburbs. But there was a lot of suburban sprawl. Actually, most of Croydon isn't suburban sprawl, but a lot of it is. That happened, post between the First World War and the Second World War in particular. And those areas were never sustainable. So actually, the intensification of those places, sensitive intensification, does actually allow those places to start to work better, so that the local shops and local services can actually survive as people walk and cycle to those places. That we can really make sure that we have the best use of our public transport infrastructure. We are lobbying hard for the improvements of that public transport infrastructure so that people can get around more sustainably as well. And at the moment, we have the situation where you walk out of a lot of the stations, and we do have a lot of stations in Croydon. You walk out of quite a few of them, and you are immediately in very low density suburbs. So we are looking at how we can actually change that. I mean, the history of all built development, all developed places is change, every single one of them. And so that next step of change, I think, in Croydon is going to be the change of those areas immediately around the transport hubs, in particular, and particularly the railway stations, and particularly the tram stops that also connecting with bus stops and that kind of thing. So we need to do that because we have a massive housing crisis. We can't just deal with the environmental crisis that we've got now and say to those people who haven't got a home or are living in overcrowded conditions or very poor quality housing, sorry, we've stopped everything else now. We're just going to concentrate on the environment. That cannot happen. We cannot say that to the 93,000 kids that are growing up in our schools at the moment. Sorry, you're probably not going to be able to have a home of your own. We need to ensure that we are developing both of these two things together. And that does mean some real challenges, but both of them need to be tackled. We need real sort of grown-up thinking on this to actually make sure that we can tackle both.
Lovely, thank you. Right, now, if I were to say to you panellists, we have 4 minutes, and I'm not going to ask you for final comments, and I'm not even going to wrap up, because there's 2 questions that I really wanted to get through, and that gives us 2 minutes on each. So one is, in being competitive, how do you collaborate without compromising your commercial environment? Your commercial advantage. I'm going to ask that one to Julia, and in the meantime, I'm going to ask one, pose the other one so you can think about it for a quick fire response, which is, getting to zero carbon requires carbon-free electricity grid. The UK as a country, we're making great strides on this, but there's a concern around the cost being passed on to bills. How do we make sure that the road to zero carbon is fair when already 17,000 Croydon households are currently at risk of being in fuel poverty? I'm going to ask a quick question, a quick response, if I may, Julia, please, to the question about how do you remain competitive whilst being collaborative, and then one around the electricity grid on a national basis and how we don't all end up paying a price for our energy that we just can't afford.
Oh, you snuck that second one in there, Alison.
No, that's not you, that was for
for everybody. Okay, sorry. So yes, well, I'm lucky. My job title, is actually Chief Collaboration Officer, really, Chief Sustainability Officer. You know what? It's like those training courses you went on. Your first management development course, where you were put on did an exercise, and the answer was you only won if you all collaborated together, because everybody had a little bit of information. And genuinely, that's how I think we're all going to succeed in business and actually in tackling this agenda. We've always been very open with what we've done. We've published our plans and strategies because it's not rocket science, a lot of it. We actually know what we need to do. And as somebody in the chat or in the question said, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. We're happy to share the steps. The really hard bit is getting the leadership in place and encouraging people to change their behaviours. If it was easy, we would all be doing it, but we need people to change.
And I think that's where the heavy involvement of the citizens panel and the citizens assembly, and the commission is really going to help Croydon, because you are engaging very actively, aren't you, with your residents and businesses to make sure that they all understand this and they're all part of your journey and indeed part of the plans. I'm looking at Councillor Newman, who may have come off mute deliberately or may not, so let's assume he has.
Well, on the big question you ask, it's kind of a simple one, really. You've got to elect the right government, that national policy, and that's not necessarily a party political point. I just want to see the national debate change in terms of sustainability. Everybody is saying the right things as we emerge from the health crisis into the economic crisis. But governments are going to be judged on their actions, and a lot of the incentives, as many of you know, around solar panels, whatever you want to frame it as, that were in place have been removed in terms of how they were contributing to the grid. So you've got to this is generational stuff. We need to see some politicians come forward nationally, and frankly, I don't care which party they are, with an absolute commitment to carry through what one might call the agenda set by David Attenborough and others on this. I think one of the things as a council leader, and Croydon's a big place, but we also recognise our limitations. There's only so much we can do up to the Croydon borders.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I'm going to ask anybody if they want to comment on the issue around how we try and prevent a big problem to fuel poor by investing in energy and moving the electricity supply to a decarbonised energy supply. I'm going to say Paul and then Rory, and then I might draw us all to a close, although Paul's just come off, so maybe he didn't want to speak. Let's go to Rory to start with then.
Well, I think the main way you're going to protect people who need protection from high energy costs and prices is by upgrading or retrofitting their homes or providing them with a highly efficient new one to move into. So, you know, we as a sector can do our bit by making sure that the sort of core fabric, the fundamentals are looked after in construction, you know, so, you know, highly efficient envelopes to start off with that produce buildings that demand as little energy as possible. And then on the political side, I think we need to, you know, as Tony just said, we need to look at the sort of choices we make as a country, and to, you know, to embrace the fact that we've made huge strides in the adoption of renewable energy, but it has been patchy. So instead of a sort of a single clear direction and strategy over time, we've had some sort of wobbles. So we can't really afford wobbles either in local policy or in long-term policy for energy for the next 10, 15 years. You know, we need to set some practical goals, simple principles, and just follow them.
I completely agree. I think the messaging is very difficult to people as well when things are eco or low carbon, or whether it's climate emergency or whatever, and there isn't consistent and simple terminology and something that tells you we are saying the same thing. And I also really personally benefit or treasure the Committee on Climate Change as the governance body that calls government to account, and I think if ever there was an example of how it's important to have a kind of independent watchdog to check on progress and take things away from being political, they're a fantastic example of that. I was going to draw this to a close, although Bonnie's going to pop back in as well and say we don't, this was only ever going to be the start, so we'd like to continue this discussion. We had originally planned to host it in AECOM's offices in Croydon. Obviously this hasn't been able to happen, and we're sorry not to see the whites of the eyes of the audience. It's a little bit strange, but hopefully this has been helpful to people, and hope that maybe people will feel challenged to make a personal commitment to something different, having heard all the debate. I'm not really in a position, as I say, to pick you out in the audience and go, what are you going to do differently after today? But I'm sure Bonnie would love to hear from you all as to what you might do differently, and I'm sure she's going to tell us how we can continue the discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Bonnie now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Just to finish up with a quick thank you to all our panellists for taking part, and thank you to Develop Croydon, Croydon Constructing Excellence Club and AECOM for making this session possible. It's clearly a really important conversation for Croydon to be having, but also as part of the programme of Real Estate Live UK, it's an important question that should be being asked and will be being asked across all the panels that we're running this week. So thank you everyone for watching. As Alison said, if you'd like to continue the conversation, there's another Croydon panel, a more wide-ranging discussion on Croydon's regeneration taking place on Thursday, so definitely have a look at tuning into that. And otherwise, feel free to get in touch with us via the Real Estate Live UK website. So thank you all for joining. Hope you have a great evening, and hopefully we'll see you on another session soon this week.